Everything in the light gray on the roughly the left half, that's liquid fuels. We use it for cars, we use it for transportation primarily. Everything in the white block on the right side, that's some sort of value-added product, whether it's asphalt for roads or industrial lubricants or petrochemicals. So roughly 3/5 of the total is liquid oil used for transport. Transport. That is by far the most important aspect of all things oil. We do not have a technology to replace that. So if we do move into a deglobalized world, anyone who cannot get the oil suddenly cannot move at scale. That is the future of our world. And that has to provide the baseline understanding when you're looking at a country's military capacity. Once you lose it, you do not get it back unless somebody decides to give it to you. The world before 1945, the advanced countries were industrial. The non-advanced countries were not industrial. And so there was a very us versus them mentality when it came to wars. Either you had the oil, and so you had an empire and colonies, or you did not, and you were a colony. We're going back there. Because oil is also required for industrial transport. And if you remove oil access at the same time you start factoring in some very, very mild climate change, you get a very different picture. Now, predicting climate change down to the city level is almost impossible, and I would argue that our math on that is absolutely awful. The best example I can offer is last summer when Portland became an easy bake oven at 120 degrees for several days. I mean, for a 2-week period, Portland, grungy, drizzly, cloudy Portland, became hotter than Las Vegas had ever been. There are plenty of predictions out there for the Houston becoming unlivable or Florida going underwater and deserts becoming bigger, but no one had predicted that the Pacific Northwest was going to be one of the early casualties of climate change. We're not that good. What we can do is look at the last century of weather data, not forecasts, data, hard data, and we can see trend lines. The biggest concern I've got is within those trend lines, there's a sign that wind patterns from the equator to the pole are becoming more extreme, largely because land heats more quickly than water, and the poles are heating more quickly than the equator as well, or the equatorial oceans. And that generates more wind going from the equator out. And so you have to look towards the equator to see what you will get. In the case of the United States, that means more tropical moisture coming in as storm systems. That may be coming as hurricanes. I'm not saying we're that good at the data, but we definitely know that we're getting more and more water in the Midwest, and that is allowing more and more farming. But if you move over to, say, the European and the Russian space, there's no tropical water south of them. And in fact, in the Russian wheat belt, there's desert between the wheat belt and the equator. So these areas are drying out. That suggests to me that we're going to have agricultural breakdowns in a lot of places, not just because of a problem with fertilizer, but because of a problem with climate. And it's hitting parts of the world harder. Now, in the United States, if you're a farmer, you're going to make mad money on this. But if you're saying the Russian wheat belt, no. I don't think the Russians are in danger of dropping back into subsistence farming anytime soon, but we can certainly kiss a lot of their exports goodbye. This is just a couple of graphics I pulled from the new book that comes out in June. The dotted lines are what matters here. Dotted lines are when shale became the majority of American energy production, and you can see how radically it changed things. So on the top two, so on the left you've got coal, and on the right you've got natural gas. Once natural gas was competing with coal in a very big way, that's the top left, production just dropped off. Hard to compete with free. And on the right, you can see where all that natural gas radically increased production, the blue line, and how it started pulling away from total consumption, the orange line. And we started becoming the world's second largest exporter of natural gas, most notably pipes to Mexico, but also a significant amount of LNG. We even have a couple of pipes up into Canada, of all places now. The bottom right, same idea, but with crude. The blue is what used to be imports. The orange is exports, and you can see that a few years ago, the lines crossed. Now, we did have a quick recombining during COVID briefly, but those have already widened back. I just don't have good enough data because the United States Department of Energy reports data differently from everyone else. We don't report crude oil production. We report refinery production, because in the eyes of the DOE, no one uses crude, people use refined product. I can see the logic, but nobody else does that, so it makes it an apples and oranges comparison, which is a real pain in the ass, and we have to wait for someone else to report American data in order to get something that's actually useful for comparison purposes. Bottom line, shale good. Canada good too. The Canadians started in roughly 1980 to crack the code on something we now know as tar sands, or the oil sands. That's the orange output. That's entirely from Alberta, with maybe a little bit from Saskatchewan. The blue is their more conventional crude. And as you can see, the orange is now as big as the blue. Now, the Canadians have probably peaked out. They have had the same issues going on in their oil patch that everywhere else in the world, where people are like, oh, oil bad. And so investment is kind of flatline. So that 5.5 number, million barrels per day, that's about where they've been now for the last year and a half. I don't expect it to get very big, any much bigger than that very soon. 3 to 8 years to bring a project online. That's just the world we're in. And they have nowhere to send it. You'll notice that all of the shale fields are between the Rockies and the Appalachians. And this is where Keystone was supposed to go. So the economic argument, especially in a world where the United States is restricting exports, the economic argument for Keystone is a little questionable, because they would be running a crude line into the most super-saturated oil markets in the world in order to get it to Houston, where it could then be refined. So all of the value add is done in the United States, and American refineries will then be able to send that product wherever they want. But Albertan crude production has to compete with U.S. crude prices. And whereas the break-even price for American shale is now sub 50, the break-even price for Albertan crude is above 70. And the economics for it don't make a huge amount of sense anymore. I think they missed their window on that, unfortunately. So it's going to be all U.S. shale all the time for the U.S. market. Love this graphic. Okay, there's a whole mess of things going on in here. First of all, the blue are fields or crude sources that I do not expect to be restricted in any meaningful way. And in the upper left-hand corner, the ones that have the slash through them, those are the U.S. major shale projects. Overall, this is talking about crude quality. So if you're in the upper left, you're talking light crude, sweet crude, which is a way of saying it has almost no contaminants. And it's usually the color and consistency of nail polish remover. It's very easy to refine. And historically speaking, that crude has sold at a significant premium to other crude grades. If you move to the bottom right, that's heavier crude, lots of contaminants, and usually that's the thick, gooey stuff that we normally think of when we think of crude oil. Here on the right, it has few contaminants, but it's still pretty thin. If you're on the bottom left, it doesn't have very many contaminants, but it's fairly thick. And this matrix is how every refinery in the world has to plan. Most refineries can only run a very specific type of crude, sometimes from a specific oil field. The chemical composition of all the crudes is very different place to place. Now, with the world I anticipate, where we're going to have a lot more military confrontations in a lot more places, the Ukraine war is just the first of many. Anything in blue is fine. Anything in green is probably fine. But by the time you get to the oranges, and especially the reds, we should not count on that crude getting out in large volumes on a regular basis. Give you an idea of where we are, Urals is right now orange. We'll see if that holds, because I anticipate at some point the European coalition is probably going to break and allow some more Urals to get out, allowing the Russians to at least export half of what they've got. But this is the sort of thing that when I put this in front of a bunch of refineries, we really hope, when I put this when I put this chart in front of refiner operators, where they have to run their entire business plan on what type of crude they can get, they really have to schedule those events on the ground floor, because this will make some of them borderline suicidal. You're talking about billion-dollar investments they have made in order to run a very specific crude grade. And for half of them, what they have hoped for is simply going to go away. Now, you can retool your refineries to run a different grade, but then you're running that grade, and you're just as vulnerable, but to a different input source. The bigger your system, the more crude grades you can access. The more you can blend two things to get something that's more approximate to what you need, the better you're going to be. The United States doesn't do a lot of that right now, but we're going to be getting into it in a very big way once we have that export ban, because then we're going to have a lot of light sweet in the neighborhood because of shale, and we're still going to have a fair amount of heavy sour because of the Canadians, and we're going to be able to muddle through. And we're going to be able to muddle through in an environment of a super saturated crude market. That'll keep prices more accessible. But if you move over into, say, East Asia, you're lucky to get whatever you can get. And you're going to have to run it through your refinery and do a lot of repairs because it will trigger a lot of damage. And then you're going to have something called run loss, which is just what it sounds like. You can't get 100% of the crude to give you product. You're probably only getting like 80 to 90%. And that's 10 to 20% of the total output that you have just burned into nothing and is wasted. And in a high price environment, that's just crippling. I have always seen three big wars coming as deglobalization kicks in. The Ukraine war is start of that one. The next one, shocker, involves the Middle East. Without the United States there saying what's what, we are going to have a fight between the Iranians and the Saudis over who's in charge. The Abqaiq facility is the largest single oil field on the planet and is responsible for half of Saudi output. Unfortunately for the Saudis, who are Sunni Arabs, Shia live in the vicinity of Abqaiq, as well as in the vicinity of all the offloading facilities to get things onto the tankers. Iran has a very similar problem. Their oil all comes from Khuzestan, and Khuzestan is the only province that they have that is not populated by Persians, but instead is populated by Arabs. So there are fifth columns in the millions living on top of all of the energy assets for both. And to think in a post-American world where these two are going at each other, that this is going to continue stably, I think is more hopeful than I am capable of being. There is one aspect to consider that is kind of funky. Right here, we've got the bypass pipelines, one from the UAE to the Gulf of Oman, and one from the fields in eastern Saudi Arabia to the offloading facilities in western Saudi Arabia on the Red Sea. Iran doesn't have a bypass pipeline. So when we do get to the point that there's a fight here, the Iranians have always said their entire game plan is we will close the straits. That's always been a threat at us. We have maintained the global order and we have made sure we can get the oil out of the Persian Gulf to everyone as a understanding for the globalized system. You get to expand economically if we get to write the security policies. But we're not here anymore. And so if the Iranians try to shut the Gulf, the Saudis will help because they can still get 5 million barrels a day out, but the Iranians can't. So we're now in a situation where both of the major powers believe they have a vested interest in shutting down oil trade. I thought China was rough before. Just wait till that happens.